Psalm 105. In verse 23, we pick the narrative up, the story of history of Israel. Okay, so we've got Joseph taken as a slave, sold as a slave. He winds up in Egypt. His character and his wisdom rise to the surface, and the saying is, a cream always rises to the top. And it does. He becomes essentially the second in command, second only to the Pharaoh himself. And the big reason for this is because Joseph was able to interpret two dreams that the Pharaoh had. Both were a restatement of the fact that there would be 7 years of prosperity and 7 years of horrible famine. Well, the 7 years of prosperity pass, and then the 7 years of famine ensue. And verse 23, then Israel entered Egypt. Now, why? Was because the famine affected Israel, not just Egypt. This was a very widespread famine. Jacob and his family finally burned through their grain, and they would have starved to death if they hadn't had some way of finding other grain. And so they did, which happened to be, as the rumor was true, in Egypt. So Jacob sent his sons, and by the way, Jacob at this time thought Joseph had already been killed. His brothers created a ruse, and Jacob believed it. Why would he? I mean, how could he know? So anyway, Jacob says to his sons, go to Israel. Here's all kinds of money for the transaction, and bring grain back so we won't die. And so they do. Joseph recognizes them, and he kind of tightens the thumb screws himself. You should read the story for yourself. Eventually, he reveals himself on the second trip. The brothers bought the grain, took it back to Israel, their dad, Jacob, and well, on the way home, it's a great story. On the way home, they opened a sack and realized their money was in the sack with the grain, the money that they had paid. They didn't understand this, but they evidently didn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth. Went home, and eventually they had gone through all the grain that they brought back. And so they needed more. Well, Jacob sends them back and says, we got to have more. And so they went back. Anyway, Joseph knew who they were. He finally reveals himself to them. And in fact, there's this reconciliation. One of I can't say it's my favorite, but it's in the top 10 of verses and sayings in the Old Testament, is when Joseph said, what you meant for evil, God turned for good, for saving many people. And that happens, doesn't it? Somebody means something bad, but God turns it into something good. Well, okay. Now, that's where we are in verse 23. Joseph sends for his father and the rest of his brothers and their wives and their children everything. And the Pharaoh gives them a very primo geography location in Goshen. Uh, Again, the story is more complex than I'm telling it, but the complexity doesn't make it boring. It makes it even more interesting. Okay, then Israel entered Jacob and entered Israel. My brain is not cooperating today. Then, in verse 23, Israel entered Egypt. Jacob resided as a foreigner in the land of Ham. He was there, but it wasn't his home. It was only his temporary home. Does that sound like us? This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. Verse 24, the Lord made his people very fruitful. He made them too numerous for their foes, whose hearts he turned to hate his people, to conspire against his servants. Now, this is the psalmist is reflecting on history, but again, pretty sure you know this, but it's worth review. The book of Exodus opens up with the fact that the Pharaoh, Joseph dies. The end of Genesis is Joseph, his death. And one of his final wishes was that he would be laid to rest back in Israel. It's kind of like it ends, the book of Genesis ends with Joseph in a pine box. And Exodus begins with the fact that Joseph was dead, and so was the Pharaoh who had favored Joseph and his family. And about 300 years transpire and pass, and in that period of time, Israel grows. I mean, they are reproducing like rabbits. And this Pharaoh, who had he hardly even had a memory of how Israel got there, but he had no regard for them, and he began to enslave them. They were numerically a force to be reckoned with. In fact, the Exodus account has Pharaoh saying, what if they rose up against us, they could overwhelm us. Well, the Lord made them very fruitful. He made them too numerous for their foes. And so Pharaoh, this would have been Ramses the second. He was a smart guy, and the geopolitics of that day pretty much revolved around might makes right, and the strongest force rules, and so in verse 25, you get insight into the fact that God was orchestrating all this. This was not just the result of chance and the whim or caprice of a world ruler. Verse 25, this is talking about Pharaoh and the Egyptians, whose hearts he turned to hate his people. Pause. Sometime when I read this, I think, so God, how does that work? So God makes them hate Israel? I thought we all had free will. And this is kind of one of those intellectual clashes for me. Well, here's how I think we can think about it. I believe that God does indeed give us free will. I'm going to read, if you read the whole of the Exodus story, there's another time where God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But this is how I see it. God turned the hearts to hate his people. God doesn't turn our hearts without our approval. In other words, and I know there's a lot of other ideas that are not like mine on this, but I have a feeling that God initiated some ideas, dropped ideas in, and the Pharaoh and the Egyptians, they took up this hard-hearted idea that Israel was to be subjugated, and we had to be very serious about this. We had to conspire against Israel. I believe that they could have not hardened their hearts had they chosen that. But I think they chose to think this way about Israel and then act toward them in this way. Can't explain it fully, and there are other explanations, but the history is clear. Jacob and his family leave Canaan, and they wind up in Egypt, and they prosper. Their families grow and grow and grow until 300 years later, there's too many of them. They become a threat to Pharaoh and his administration, his regime, his ideas. And so by the time Moses comes on the scene, they had it again. Go back and read Genesis, first, 7 or 8 chapters give you the idea that this was not a happy time for Israel. The Egyptians, Pharaoh and his crowd had made it so that life for the Israelite in Egypt was simply oppressive and horrible. All right. Verse 26. He sent Moses his servant and Aaron, whom he had chosen. Well, yeah. And the whole Moses story, his mom took a basket and covered the outside with pitch and tar so that it would be more or less waterproof. Pharaoh's plan was that all the male babies in Israel were to be thrown into the Nile, where they would be devoured by crocodiles. And that was his birth control effort. But Moses' mom and dad decided they couldn't do that. Now, here's just a little interesting thing. Aaron, I think, must have been older than Moses. He was born ahead of the time when the Pharaoh decreed that all the boy babies should be destroyed. Well, okay. Moses goes into the Nile. He's discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter. She falls instantly in love with him. And she adopts him. And his own mother becomes his nursemaid. And he grows up in Pharaoh's courts as though he were the grandson of the Pharaoh. This is not just circumstantial. This is no coincidence. This is God's hand at work in history. And I think that's the point of what the psalmist is saying. History is not by chance. History has a grand orchestrator, a director, an originator, and it is God. All right, pick it up here next time on So Care with Stevie.